Okay, we are rolling. It is Wednesday, August 13th, one day after the City Council and Paulsville Municipal Authority meetings. So I'm going to kind of go through the agenda. I don't think I'm going to share it this time. Last time I shared it, it went black screen, so I'm not really sure. But I've shared it on my page so you guys can kind of, take a look at it. But we're kind of review what we did at City Council last night. We had approval of the consent agenda, with all the minutes from all the various boards, both our prior city council meeting, Park and Tree Board, beautification, planning and zoning, Paul's Valley Tourism, and we approved purchase orders to the tune of $364,000 for the dates of July 18th through August 7th. There were no board appointments. We approved the financial statement. So as I was sort of looking through the financial statement, June is the financial statement we looked at. We haven't gotten July yet. There were some reconciliation issues we had to catch up on, so we're a little bit delayed in getting the June financials, but we finally got them last night. And so we could kind of look in aggregate how we did overall for the year as well. But for the month, I knew that sales tax, I mentioned this previously, was probably up by about 2% from previous year, which is good. We did experience a loss. Overall expenses for general government were to the tune of $791,000, with revenue for general government at $725,000. And so we had about a $66,000 shortfall, which is probably about half, maybe even 2/3 less than it has been. And so we're making headway in that way. Major expenses associated with the city were administrative expenses at $88,000 for the month. Police at 138 and fire at 80. And so that was sort of the main breakdown. Other things that sort of jumped out to me, were there opportunities to catch up on some things because of the year-to-date sort of things. There was some electric overages that were, relevant to our budget. I know the golf course, so the resale items were over by a tune of about $11,000. Half of that's pro shop, half of that's for concession. And I'm sure that as we did that, the hope is that we had more revenue. And I knew that we generated about $300,000. So we were about on par for budget relevant to that. However, the expense line items for that were a little bit more expensive. So something to look at. My assumption is if we're purchasing more things to sell, that we're actually having more revenue generated as well. So looking through as well, there were some small overages with regards to unemployment expenses, materials, but nothing significant. So the financial package for city government was approved. So moving through, we looked at a code enforcement bond schedule. And so basically, it has been untouched for quite a period of time. And so from a code enforcement perspective, I want to say most of the code enforcement things are at about $131 per offense. And then looking at what we're wanting to do now, $228 to $278 for various things, whether it's overgrown lawns, things in your yard, all of those things, associated court fees. And so this was an adjustment to be consistent with what's going on in communities of our size around us from that perspective. And so that was approved by the council. And I can show maybe a picture of that or share that PDF of what the actual bond schedule will be for various code enforcement infractions throughout the city. And then there's issues with regards to warnings, second infractions, and the associated cost. So I may share that with you guys as well. There was an address by Mr. Stephen Wilkerson regarding fees and procedures for animal welfare. He had an issue with his dog. I guess maybe had gotten out. There was some discussion in regards to tagging and the associated fines with that. And so he wasn't aware that you had to have your animal tagged. That ordinance has been there really since the 70s. You can get that at animal welfare or animal control services. I think it's like $5. He was talking about like the fine was $150. And sort of the idea of warnings with certain things. And so there was some discussion on that and discussion on ways that we could get that information out to folks. And then sort of the purpose of the tagging, what are we doing in relation to it? I think we're sort of identifying, animals in the city, tracking number of animals we have. If somebody loses an animal, we find it, it's a way to get it back to the owner. those sorts of things. But again, there was some discussion on that and some thoughts on how to get the word out that, hey, tag your animal. There was a consideration of an approval for billboards for the Toy and Action Figure Museum to the tune of $7,287. This had been tabled just because we didn't have all the official paperwork sort of done. Tourism didn't want to go specifically through the city to pay for the billboards or be responsible for that. So the Toy and Action Figure Museum will be responsible for these billboards. They will make the payment and then seek reimbursement from tourism, just like everyone else sort of does in that way. And so that was approved. Something kind of interesting was there was an address by Lochner, who is sort of an engineer for the airport. And so Mr. Carson and the representative from Lochner were there, and sort of there are some issues in regards to reconstruction of runway 17-35. And there were just some issues that needed to be addressed per FAA. And so he kind of went into some of those things, more technical specifications. But the long and short of it, basically, and I'll kind of get to my notes on that, is that they had gotten various bids to repair, refurbish, and address the runway per FAA specifications. And so the cheapest bid was from a company by the name of COS, $10 million in regards to the runway. I know it kind of gets your attention when you kind of hear that. However, what Lochner is doing is utilizing FAA and state grants. So between 3 FAA and 1 state grant, majority of that $10 million cost will be taken care of through the grants. And so when you think of it from that perspective, and I kind of asked the question, like, what would happen if we don't do this, right? I mean, and so basically we have about $18 million that has been put into the airport. I mean, it's a beautiful facility between the new hangar and some of the, the waiting room and areas for folks. And so in that way, $18 million has been spent over the last several years, maybe 5 years is a number that was sort of stated. And that if we don't do these repairs, the airport shuts down. And so then, and most of those dollars came from grants and other various, ways. And we obviously had some money, matching monies in there as well. So it would just close the airport, and we would lose those dollars that we had sort of gotten through grants and other investment through the city. And so kind of a no-brainer when you think of it from the tune of majority of the 10 million will be paid via grants that Lochner is helping obtain. And so that will leave about $293,000 or 2.5 with a 2.5% interest rate. These items are budgeted over the course of the next 2 years to the tune of $125,000 a year. And so they're already kind of baked in the cake relevant to budgets. And then that would leave us about $43,000 that we'd have to come up with to pay for the remainder. So again, capital outlay of $293,000 over a 2-year period to obtain $10 million in grant funding. And so the ideology is that the runway would be shut down for 365 days, but with all the other things going on, it could be longer. And so there would be a November start date, and they would just want to get on that as soon as possible. And so that was sort of presented to us. And so when you think of it from that perspective, if you don't do this, closure of the airport, loss of the $18 million we've already invested through grants and other things, the council voted to approve Lochner's recommendation for the award, to allow them to apply for grants and grant offers from the FAA and ODAA for the reconstruction of the runway. And then consideration of cost, the construction company to do the work, and then agreement for construction services. And so basically, the way that it works, the grants have to be there for us to be able to participate with the work. So it's not like the city will be owed like the 10 million. We have the match of the 293,000 over a 2-year period. So that was approved. Big number. I know it gets people's attention. I know when the 10 million was mentioned, it kind of got my attention. But again, being that majority, if not almost all of that is going to be covered via grants, I think that's a really cool thing. So there was no executive session. I know under manager comments, one thing worth mentioning from the city manager, and I talked to him a little bit about this in regards to properties the city owns that we're not doing anything with. and whether we want to look at selling some of those properties or releasing certain properties to organizations that could keep up with the upkeep. We still had a little bit of a budget shortfall in June, to kind of get our expenses on the right side, particularly if we're not doing certain things with certain facilities or properties. And he had sort of made a comment of that, just as a general comment under city manager comments. So just an awareness that the city is sort of, tightening its belt, looking at things that it wants to take care of, things that it needs to take care of. Do we want to sell certain properties, buildings, that sort of thing? So more to come with that, I'm sure. And then the meeting was closed as far as city council. As we kind of went through to the Pauls Valley Municipal Authority, there really wasn't a whole lot in association with it. We basically had approval of the consent agenda and approval of purchase orders to the tune of $423,000, $423,000. Look at my notes and see if there's anything else really that jumped out to me. There were some things that I had kind of asked Joe about in relation to PVMA. And some of that was associated with like special funds, but if you look at where we were with regards to all the repairs we've had at the water plant, overall PVMA expenses were at $631,000 against a revenue of $610,000. So we lost $21K. But again, we're investing in infrastructure. I sort of had some questions relevant to special funds. The TIF is right there in the industrial district, and we were talking about the TIF had expired. We're going to renew a TIF or try to reestablish a TIF for the area. But there was a certain amount of dollars that were there. And I had noticed this year we'd spent $306,000 through the TIF relevant to the water plant. That went directly to repairs. And I wanted to confirm that that's where that had sort of gone. Looking at the overall expenses year to date, because June was the end of the year, $1.85 million for water plant against $1.5 million in revenue. We've had discussions on the cost of producing water and whether rates would be increased. And so we're seeing obviously more expense versus revenue on that side relevant to the maintenance and production of water. Relevant to sanitation, we did a little bit better. So at $1.37 million in expense, and the revenue side was pretty neutral with that. So there were no losses there. Trying to see if there was anything else. I had some questions in regards to the special funds, for streets. We demonstrated like $59K. Paid for the period of 7/8/18 through 8/7. And, where did that sort of go? Because, I know people sometimes say, are we working on the streets? We certainly are. But the cost of doing so is certainly fairly expensive. So $59,000 was allocated to pay for some street repairs and associated things. I think you guys will see some of the things. I've shared some of that in regards to on my council page. And I think that was pretty much it. And so we adjourned the Pauls Valley Municipal Association Authority meeting, and we were done. So that was everything I know, and now everything you know. So I hope you guys have a great Wednesday, and we'll talk to you guys soon.